Hi, and welcome to the NBA show. My name is Morten Jensen, and today I'll be talking about NBA buyouts and why they're just not that big of a deal. Stay tuned. So in terms of NBA buyouts, everything needs to be taken into context. I know there's been a lot of uproar, especially on social media, about players such as Blake Griffin, LaMarcus Aldridge, and Andre Drummond being bought out of their respective contracts and then thus being able to be signed by major NBA championship contenders. That said, there's a reason they're available. It's not as if the Detroit Pistons, for example, could actually have traded Blake Griffin. Lord knows they tried. The same principle applies to the Cleveland Cavaliers, who desperately tried to get off of Andre Drummond's contract. The same applied for the San Antonio Spurs, who tried to move LaMarcus Aldridge. And you know what? They didn't find any takers. Because of that, you're finding yourself in a very unique situation where you have to do something different. If you can't trade that specific player, you need to pivot in a way where you can do something else. And in this case, you save money. In terms of buyouts, it's really about the player giving a certain amount of money back. Blake Griffin had 2 years left, or well, a year after this left on his deal. He gave back a substantial amount of money, so the Detroit Pistons came out as winners, so to speak, in that scenario by saving money on that, and he went to go to a contender where he has a chance to win a championship this very season. Everybody wins. It really boils down to what the situation is. Now, of course, if you have a player who you can get something for in a trade and you end up buying him out just so he can go sign with a contender, that would be poor taste. That would be a justifiable rage, or however you want to quantify it. But at this point, given the context of these contracts, it just was not a feasible scenario. These guys were not traded. These guys simply couldn't get traded. Andre Drummond last year, when he got traded from the Pistons to the Cavaliers, fetched just Brandon Knight, John Henson, and a second-round draft pick. Neither guy is in the league anymore, and a second-rounder is, well, a second-rounder. So that value just diminished over time. Fortunately, as I pointed out in the video I did about the Cleveland Cavaliers, they didn't give up a whole lot. It was a worthy gamble. It didn't pay off. It's fine. They lost virtually nothing in this. They got great production from Drummond while he was there. There's just no cost lost here in that sense. There are no assets wasted. It's fine. They were in a situation where they didn't give up a whole lot. The Detroit Pistons, however, that's a sunk cost with Griffin. While they did save money, as I alluded to, they really gave up a ton, including Tobias Harris, to get him. It wasn't pretty. Considering what they gave up for Blake Griffin and compared to the fact that they didn't get any compensation in return by buying him out, yes, that stands in stark contrast, and it's certainly not a positive situation for the Pistons to find themselves in. But look, injuries robbed him of his athleticism, it robbed him of his effectivity. The fact that the Pistons were a bad team didn't really help matters. Why would he be motivated? There were a lot of subplots going on with the Detroit Pistons. Now, in terms of LaMarcus Aldridge, that situation is a little bit different. The Spurs didn't give anything up to get him. They signed him as a free agent outright, so there were no assets wasted back in the day. It just kind of ran its course. Given the contract was significant, he couldn't be moved. The Spurs tried to see if they could fetch another expiring and maybe send him to a place he wanted to go, and no such deal materialized. There were no such deal in the cards. They tried multiple teams. No one really wanted to pick up that tab on the remaining $24 million this season on Aldridge's contract, which is fair. He's going to be 36 this year anyway. Every team would know that he wants to go to a contender, so mid-tier teams were like, why would we? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for us to take on Aldridge given his age. We're not in championship contention. Why would we really go this route? We also know that if we were to trade for him, he would get a bit frustrated. He probably wouldn't even want to report to us. He probably wouldn't even want to play for us. He wants to go to a place where he can win a championship. That makes sense. So because of that, the suitors declined. There just simply weren't enough suitors. To the larger point, It's a question really that boils down to, is there a problem in the buyout market? Let's just be honest here. This isn't about Blake Griffin. It's not about LaMarcus Aldridge. This is about Andre Drummond. Because we're seeing a guy who is a 27-year-old center averaging 17.5 points, 13.5 rebounds, an in-prime guy, former All-Star, and he's getting, bought out for nothing and signed with the defending champions, the Lakers, for a presumably minimum contract. That is going to make a lot of people frustrated. And I get it. It's the rich get richer scenario. People hate that. On the surface of it, yes, it makes sense that people get upset. But again, context matters. Of course the Cavaliers tried to flip Drummond. Of course they did. Is it a bad narrative that a former All-Star producing All-Star caliber numbers goes to the defending champions? In a way, yes. But look, I want to flip it around a little bit. I say good on the Lakers for actually getting fantastic value out of him here at this point. What is presumed to be a minimum contract for Drummond, and just a note here, we don't really know the contractual terms, but it is heavily implied by everyone involved that it will be a minimum contract. Certainly, it's a contract that doesn't do his production justice, so the Lakers are getting a real steal here. And you can argue, does that just make them a shoo-in for the championship? Not necessarily, but it does improve their chances substantially. And yes, does that make the league as a whole less competitive? It's tough, right? Because look, there is a different component here at play as well. The Cavaliers, theoretically, could have just sat on him for the end of the season. They could have decided, we don't want to actually buy him out. We just want to stick with him, not giving him up to anyone else. It's fine, he'll expire, then he can sign for wherever he wants and for whatever he pleases. Like, that's fine. The thing about that is, that's not gonna work for NBA agents. That's going to give them a bad rep for players. It's ultimately going to paint them in a very negative light with the NBPA, the National Basketball Players Association. So what were they to do? If they just sat on him, wasted him by having him on the bench, not playing him, then what? It seemed like the Cavaliers need to safeguard themselves. They need to be a team that free agents will have somewhat interest in. They need to be a team that doesn't have a bad reputation. And by playing that card of being player friendly while also talking to their guys and going, you don't want to be here, that's fine, what can we do to help? That helps them in the long term. Does that mean short term that there will be some consequences? For example, like this, where Drummond joins a contender? Yes. Again, I still look at this through the perspective of the Lakers. This is great value. It's going to help them. This is just really good, solid GMing in being able to lock guys in who outproduces their contracts. But I also get that championship contenders, such as the Nets, who signed both Aldridge and Blake Griffin, and the Lakers who got Drummond, it is unfortunate that there is this narrative that guys of certain stature goes to these teams without looking elsewhere. Now, I know that there are a lot of reports out there saying that Aldridge would look at a lot of teams and Andre Drummond would look at a lot of teams, but their mind was likely made up a long while ago, and that's fine. I definitely support the players should be free to move wherever they want to go. But yes, it does make a little bit of an issue, the fact that they won't go to teams that are slightly below the competitor line, because they would obviously improve those teams and maybe even catapult them into contention. Now, for example, if Andre Drummond went to the Boston Celtics instead, a team that's flirting a little bit too much with the 500 record, would that improve them drastically? I actually think so. And not to the point where they would become favorites, but you could make the argument that his placement on that team would make them a contender nevertheless. That said, it's a free market. Everyone is free to go where they want to go if they're a free agent. Those are the rules. One thing I've seen as well is people suggesting that there needs to be some sort of penalty for good teams that sign players. I think that's a slippery slope. How would you police that? How would you actually go about looking at NBA teams and say, you're better because of X? Because if you put that filter on, isn't that in a way discrimination? Then you would argue, well, your team is better because you have X, Y, and Z, and we are going to presume that this team over here that doesn't have X, Y, and Z is worse. Well, okay, but then you're actually putting a lot of stock into a certain player. How would you would have to have a measure? You can't really measure that. It's inquantifiable. So that idea should just be rejected. I understand the premise of it, but there's no way to really put this into effect. Now, if you go by record, okay, but records can be skewed. The Lakers, again, a perfect example. They are missing both LeBron and Anthony Davis at this point, so their record right now is worse than it would be if they're healthy. Ergo, if you go by record, they would suddenly be okay-ish. You can't really justify that. You can't really look at it and go, oh, we need to change the system based on record, based on player quality. You can't. You would basically put handcuffs on the whole free market evolution that there is in the NBA in terms of free agency, which after all, this is. This is free agency during the non-free agency period. What can you do? Ultimately, we just have to have faith in the system at place. And super teams, which I don't think the Lakers are, I don't think Andre Drummond makes them a super team, even though a lot of people disagree with me on that notion. It is created by the reputation of certain players that other players want to play with. And you know what? That's an asset. When you sign LeBron James, you know damn well that there are a whole slew of players that wants to join in and play with him. That's part of why you want LeBron James. So right now, the Lakers are reaping the benefits of that signing. It just is what it is. Had LeBron played elsewhere, it probably would have been that team Drummond had gone to, or somewhere else entirely if that specific team had been a championship contender. There's so many ways to look at this. It isn't Lakers specific. It isn't Brooklyn specifics, although I do get the contrast of both of those teams playing in superbly large markets does shape a somewhat negative narrative that the East and West Coast are getting preferential treatment. But look, they just made great roster moves. They signed the right caliber of guys. Do they have an advantage? Yes, they absolutely do. I think more so than anything, that's where you need to start. You need to look at the teams in New York and Los Angeles, and you have to figure out how can we, as an NBA league, what can we do to make our product more appealing on a nationwide scale, so it isn't just the Lakers or the Knicks and the Nets. Well, the Knicks not right now, but you catch my drift. Why not Boston? Why not Chicago? Why not the Heat? Well, the Heat are actually up there. They have a great culture, but they are not still the Lakers or the Knicks and Nets. But there have to be a different path here to making it more of a parity system. Because right now, based on market, it's not. Those are just the cards that we're dealt. That's where we need to start. Personally, I still don't see this as a problem. There's a reason teams didn't want Andre Drummond. Look, here's a guy, again, 27 years old, in prime, averaging huge numbers, and teams were not interested. There's a reason for that. Don't get blindsided by the numbers. He is a flawed player, but I get the perception. I get the narrative. I get all the complicated issues that arise with these signings. I get it. But this isn't the fault of these specific NBA teams. If there even is a fault to be found here, which I sincerely doubt there is, it comes down to market size and how those markets are used. This has always been a problem. This has always been a thing. This isn't new. And yeah, sure, you can use these recent examples as underlining that issue. That's fine, but it's not going to change. Fan bases are just larger in those areas. They're more dedicated. It is what it is. If the Indiana Pacers, one of the smallest market teams in the NBA, had a much higher rate of fans, had a more dedicated fan group, they would be in that as well. They just don't. So at the end of the day, complain away. I get it. I'll listen. I totally hear you. But I look at this as teams using their market using the players already on the roster to get better, which, in case you've forgotten, is the entire point of team construction.